Well, good morning. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Cheryl, and I'm the Family Ministries Director here at the church, and I'm also the wife to Pastor Rick. So this is really odd being in his position this morning, but it is a pleasure, actually, to be sitting here this morning. My feet are starting to get sore, so... Well, today's Mother's Day, and I came across a few things that I thought some of our moms might be able to identify with. You may know you're a mom when your feet stick to the kitchen floor and you just don't care. Or when your kids are fighting and you threaten to lock them in a room together and not let them out until someone's bleeding. Any moms ever felt like that? Or you can't find your cell phone, so you ask a friend to call you, running around the house madly, following the sound until you locate the phone downstairs in the laundry basket. I've actually done this. Or you may know you're a mom when going to the grocery store by yourself is a vacation. I remember those days. Or taking a 15-minute shower with the door locked feels like a day at the spa. Spit is your number one cleaning agent. You may know you're a mom when you know you can never go to the bathroom alone without someone screaming on the other side of the door. Or you spend a half an hour searching for your sunglasses only to have your teenager say, Mom, why don't you just wear the ones that are pushed up on your head? I've had that happen too. Or finally, you may be a mom if you are out for a nice romantic dinner with your husband, enjoying some adult conversation, when suddenly you realize that you've reached over and you started to cut up his steak. Well, I want to say thank you to our moms here today. You truly are a blessing to the lives of your husbands and your children. It's great to see so many people here honoring their moms. I'm sure that some of you are here only because it is Mother's Day, and I will do my best not to make this experience too painful for you. Being a mom is a tough job. It's hard. It causes sleepless nights. It brings more than its share of troubles. It can often be a thankless job, but it also has to be one of the most rewarding and greatest privileges that we have. We've been going through a series here at Gateway called Starting Point, discussing the fact that our faith has a starting point. For some, it began as a child. For others, maybe it was later on into adulthood. But I'm sure at some point in your life, most of you have probably decided that you would talk to God, or pray, as we like to call it in Christian circles, to see if God really is listening. It may have started with a bedtime prayer, or maybe it was during a time of crisis, a time of need, or help in making a decision. So you prayed, but God didn't seem to answer, or at least you didn't think so. So you decided, what's the point? And you just stopped. This morning, I want to talk to you about our conversations with God. Now, as a mom of 2 children, it was really important to me when the girls were younger that they understood and believed that God heard and listened to their prayers. When we first came here to London, the girls really wanted a dog. Now, if you know me, you know that I am an animal lover, and in particular, I love dogs. So it really wasn't a matter of convincing me. However, I did see this as a great opportunity to teach my girls about prayer. So I said to them, well, if you really want a dog, then you need to pray and ask God for one. And I'm a big believer that when we pray, we should pray specifically. So I said, here's a list of the things that you need to ask God for. I said, it needs to be a puppy. It has to be a small breed that doesn't shed. It has to be a female, and it has to be free. Well, the girls listened and said, okay, no problem, walked out of the room, and Rick looked at me and he said, we're never getting a dog. And I said to him, "Oh, Pastor, you have little faith. Come on, don't you believe that God answers prayer?" Well, our girls began to diligently pray every night, listing out the things that we wanted, and we're believing that God was going to answer their prayer. At that time, our daughter Ashley was taking gymnastics, and her gymnastics coach happened to be a Christian. And she told her coach one day that her and her sister had been praying for this dog. And so her coach listened and said, "Oh, great." Well, a few weeks later, one evening, I received a phone call. And the person on the other end of the line said, "Hi," she said, "You don't know me, but I am the sister to your daughter's gymnastic coach." And I said, "Oh, that's nice." And she said, "I have a dog that just had a litter of puppies." I said, "Oh?" She said, "Oh, by the way, the breed is a small breed, and they don't shed, and I would like to give your family a female puppy for free." God had met every one of our requests. He had heard the prayers of two little girls and answered them. Needless to say, this was an incredible anchor point for my children's faith. They realized that they served a God who heard them. Today we're going to take a look at a woman who desperately wanted to be a mom. Now, for those of you who are not moms this morning, what we learn from this woman's story is applicable to everyone. So while this is a Mother's Day message, I think there's something to be learned for everyone. Our story is found in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 1, and it was written by the woman's son, Samuel. It's the story of a woman named Hannah. She was one of the wives of a man named Elkanah. Now, his other wife had children, but Hannah did not. Now, it was customary each year to go to the temple to worship and make sacrifice to the Lord. Every year, the day would come for Elkanah to offer a sacrifice. And on that day, he would give a share of his meat to his other wife and children, but he would give 2 shares to Hannah. That's because he loved her and she did not have children. Now, the other woman would tease Hannah and try to make her angry because she didn't have children. She had been teasing her for years. And her husband would say to her, "Hannah, why are you crying? Why don't you eat? Why are you so unhappy? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" One time they had finished eating and drinking, and Hannah stood up. And Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the temple and was observing Hannah. She was very sad and had been weeping. And then she began to pray to the Lord. She made a promise to him and said, "Lord, you rule over all. Please see how I'm suffering," she said. "Show concern for me. Don't forget about me. Please give me a son. And if you do, I'll give him back to you. Then he will serve the Lord all the days of his life." Now Eli watched her and thought she was drunk because her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out of her mouth. She was praying in her heart. Eli scolded her for being drunk, and she said to him, "I'm not drunk. I'm simply telling the Lord my troubles." Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel give you what you have asked him for." She said, "May you be pleased with me." And then she left and had something to eat, and her face wasn't sad anymore. And the Lord blessed her, and after some time, Hannah became pregnant. She had a baby boy, and she said, "I asked the Lord for him," so she named him Samuel. Well, I would invite you to pay attention for the next few minutes as we explore how we can learn the principles of Hannah's prayer. So, what do we see? First of all, Hannah had a problem. Well, I think this is something that certainly every one of us can identify with. We all have problems. Some are financial, some are relational, some are physical. Unfortunately, problems aren't something that we can escape. As a matter of fact, Jesus told us that we were going to have trouble in life. And in this story, we're introduced to a man named Elkanah, and we're told that he has 2 wives. Now, I'm sure Rick would say that it's challenging enough with 1 wife. Why on earth would any man want 2? See? However, this was common to culture during this time. And one of his wives had children, but Hannah did not. Now, it's important to understand that a wife's primary role in those days was to provide her husband with children. And a barren woman was considered a curse, and Hannah would have been looked down upon. She would have been spiritually confused, wondering why God had not given her children, socially disgraced, and emotionally depressed. I'm pretty certain at this point in her life, Hannah would have thought that Mother's Day was a ripoff. The one thing that she desperately wanted, she couldn't have. And to make matters worse, here she's living in a home where this other woman is constantly reminding her of the fact that she doesn't have kids. One day she reaches a breaking point and weeps and is so overcome by grief that she stops eating. I'm sure some of you are able to identify with Hannah this morning. Maybe you are in the middle of some kind of anguish, and you are questioning why God is not doing something. I want to say to you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you are hurting this morning, but I want you to know that God cares about you. We're told that her husband tries his best to comfort his wife. Hannah, he says, why are you crying? Why don't you eat? Why are you so unhappy? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Now, while his efforts are admirable, it does little to comfort Hannah. What Elkanah is doing here is something that many husbands do when their wives are upset. Instead of listening to her pain, he seems to be rationalizing her problems and her feelings. Now, I'm sure that none of you husbands here today have ever done that with your wives. Tried to fix their problems. He's trying to solve when he should be seeking to understand. He's basically saying, baby, you've got me. Come on, what more do you need? I could hear Rick saying this, actually. I mean, am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? I'm sure he did not really understand just how deeply Hannah wanted to have a child. After all, it's possible to love one's husband and still want to have children. There may be some of you here this morning that feel just like Hannah. You have wanted desperately to have a child. You've been trying for years, and nothing seems to be happening. I want you to know that if you've been hurt by someone's insensitive comments or their best intentions, God understands your pain this morning. So we know that Hannah had a problem, but let's take a look at how Hannah dealt with the situation. She didn't lash out at those around her. I mean, think about it. The woman that's living with her, that's reminding her on a daily basis that she doesn't have kids, she could have lashed out and gotten angry with her. She could have blamed her husband and said, you know what, maybe if I had a different man, I'd have kids by now. Or she could have gotten angry with God. But Hannah doesn't do any one of those things. Instead, Hannah expressed her faith in God through prayer. Maybe you are facing problems today and you're thinking, I must not be good or a godly person, or else this wouldn't be happening to me. I want you to know this morning that a godly mom or a godly person does not mean that you're not going to have problems. You're going to have problems, but you need to know that you don't have to face them alone. And just because you have them does not mean that you are not loved by God. So what do we do in those moments? What do we do when we're faced with a difficult situation? Well, what did Hannah do? We're told that Hannah prayed. Hannah had some real problems that were causing her pain and anguish. But instead of giving up, she looked up. She looked to God in prayer. Often it's not until we're facing problems that we turn to God. So oftentimes we try and handle things on our own. but she was at the end of herself. She cried out to God in her weakness. She did not turn away from God in her problems, but rather she turned to God with her problems. Let me say that again. Hannah did not turn away from God in her problems, but rather she turned to God with her problems. She expressed the way she was feeling to God in prayer. We're told that Hannah was very sad, that she wept, and she prayed to the Lord. Being in relationship with God does not mean putting on a show to everyone that everything is great. I have to admit that sometimes as moms, we can be guilty of this, especially in front of our kids. We want our kids to see us as strong and having everything together. I want you to know this morning that it's okay for your kids to see that you're struggling, that you're going through a hard time. What it's important for them to know is that despite the fact you're going through the difficult time, that you're looking to God to help you through it. My mom used to use our bathroom as her prayer room. And I knew that if in the middle of the day the door was locked, Mom was often on her knees praying and asking God for help. Being in relationship with God means being real and expressing how you are truly feeling and asking God for his help. God is not surprised by our emotions. It's okay to break down in front of him. That's what Hannah did. She went on and she made a promise. Lord, she said, you rule over all. Please see how I'm suffering. Show concern for me. Don't forget about me. Please give me a son. And if you do, I'll give him back to you. And then he will serve you all the days of his life. As part of her prayer, she makes a vow that if God gives her a son, she would dedicate him to the Lord for his entire life. Her son would become a priest who would serve in the temple, and he would be bound by a vow to be set apart for God's service. Having worked through the years of barrenness and the problems that this caused, Hannah now realizes a very important truth. Children are not just for parents. They're for the Lord. Moms, if you hear nothing else today, remember that. Your kids do not exist for you. They belong to God. Nothing we really have belongs to us anyway, and that includes our children. It's interesting to note that after her request, we are told that Hannah kept on praying to the Lord. Now, this wasn't some quick popcorn prayer that she just, blurted out in a couple of minutes and then walked away. We're told that she continued to pray. I think far too often we give God a quick prayer and think that that's sufficient. Well, God, bless my kids, keep them safe, watch over them. Okay, have a nice day. And we go on our way. Now, I'm not saying that God won't answer a quick prayer, but when we're wanting something from God, something that is weighing heavy on our heart, we need to take time and spend it with him. As a parent, think about it. How would you feel if your kid walked into the room and said, Mom, Dad, I want a cell phone. Okay, see ya. And walked out. I know I, as a parent, would be like, I think we need to sit down and talk about this. Why do you think you need a cell phone? What's the reason? Who's going to pay for it? We would want to discuss it. Why do we not think that when we come to God with something that is heavy on our heart, that he wouldn't want to take time with us? I think it's important that we need to be reminded when we approach God with our requests, we need to take some time. After she finished praying, we're told she left and had something to eat, and then her face wasn't sad anymore. This has to be one of the best parts of the story to me. After spending time in prayer, it said that her face was no longer sad. Now, God hadn't answered her prayer yet. Are you hearing me? God had not answered her prayer yet. but she had left her concerns with the Lord, and now she was experiencing the peace that passes all understanding. When we've spent time with God in prayer and met with Him, that alone can be enough to change our face. You need to pray sometimes until your face is no longer sad. Pray until what God is wanting to do on the inside of you is reflected on the outside. So we know that Hannah had a problem. We know that she went to God in prayer. Next, we see that Hannah experienced God's provision. We are told that the Lord blessed her and that after some time, Hannah became pregnant. She had a baby boy, and she said, I asked the Lord for him, so she named him Samuel. Hannah's attitude was one of expectance. She didn't feel that she was praying to a weak or a powerless God. She was praying to the God who had delivered her people from Egypt after 400 years of slavery and led them to the land He had promised them to. She believed that God was capable of answering her request. So she prayed, expecting Him to do something. Now, I want to be cautious here. I am not saying that just because you pray, God will give you what you want. God does not always answer our prayers the way we want Him to, but He does promise to answer. I'm saying that you will receive God's provision one way or another. I understand the pain of not receiving the answer from God that you want. My mom will be gone 8 years ago this year, and I prayed desperately for God to heal her. I prayed for years, and then I watched her in the last year of her life suffer terribly, and then God took her. So I understand the disappointment of God not answering your prayers the way we want Him to. But I can stand here, well, actually I can sit here today and tell you that despite the fact that I didn't get the answer that I wanted, I experienced God's provision during one of the most painful and difficult times in my life. And while I do not understand, my trust and my faith in Him remained strong. God's provision does not necessarily change our circumstances, but God's provision does change us. We still may not understand everything, and that's okay. We don't need to. Instead, we know everything that we need to know, that God cares for us. He's working out His will in our life, and that's the best place to be. So we know that Hannah prayed. She saw God's provision. Next, we see that Hannah kept her promise. We're told in the story that after Samuel was weaned, she went back to the temple and presented Samuel to Eli and said, "Pardon me, sir. I'm the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. And that's just as sure as you are alive, I prayed for this child. The Lord has given me what I asked Him for, so now I'm giving him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he'll be given to the Lord." Hannah kept her promise that she made to God. Now, moms, imagine with me for a moment. You've prayed your whole life for a child. God has finally granted your request, and now you're going to give him back to the Lord for his service. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for her. Many of us have dedicated our children to the Lord. Some made that promise today. Others of you made it years ago. But what exactly does that mean? I came across this paragraph from Dr. Clarence Sexton, and he says, "Giving a child to God means to desire what the Lord desires for that child. Holding on to children is a difficult thing, but in order to give a child to God, we must take our hands off and turn them loose for God's will and purpose. God's plan for their lives is not ours. They are ours, but they are only ours to rear. They are placed into our care and keeping only for a while. Although we continue the parent-child relationship throughout the years, Giving our children to God may begin with a simple act of dedication, but it must become a continuous act of surrendering them to the will of God all the days of their lives. A lot of people make promises to God, only to forget them once time passes or when they get the answer that they were looking for. Not Hannah. She fully intended to keep her promise because she knew that Samuel did not really belong to her anyway. Hannah was willing to sacrifice herself for the sake of her son. She loved him so much that she was willing to give up a mother's greatest joy, the joy of bringing up her son and having him around her. She was committed to do whatever it took to help him reach his godly potential. Now, I have to confess, this isn't an easy thing to do as a mom. Now that my daughters are adults, I have to remind myself at times that God has a destiny for each of them. And as much as I would like them to always stay close by to me, have them over every Sunday for dinner, maybe one day have the grandkids over on a regular basis, I realize that might not be, no pressure, Gabby. Okay, I'm not wanting them yet. Okay. I do have to remind myself, though, that I made a promise to God, that I dedicated them to Him. And that means that if God chooses to take them halfway around the world to accomplish His plans for their lives, then I need to be okay with that. Moms, are you okay with that? When you dedicated your children to the Lord, are you okay with the fact that that might mean they might be someplace else and not that close to you? So we know that Hannah had a problem. We know that she prayed. She experienced God's provision. She kept her promise. And finally, she praised God. After Hannah dropped Samuel off at the temple, the second chapter of Samuel tells us that she breaks into praise and says this: "The Lord has filled my heart with joy. He has made me strong. I can laugh at my enemies. I'm so glad He saved me. There isn't anyone holy like the Lord. There isn't anyone except Him. There isn't any rock like our God." Now notice, Hannah doesn't point to Samuel when she drops him off at the temple and say, "Look, Eli, isn't he the cutest little boy you've ever seen? And let me tell you, he is so smart, and he's saying his prayers." She didn't even talk about Samuel. She didn't even make mention of him. She overlooked the gift and gave praise to the giver. Why? Because she knew that God had blessed her and that Samuel was blessed of the Lord. She knew that he was completely in God's hands, the hands of the one that she could completely trust, that had drawn her close, that had heard her in her distress, and that had provided for her and blessed her. This was the God that she could trust with her most valuable earthly possessions, even her son. So, we see this morning that Hannah had a problem. Just like us, she had a situation that she needed help with. What problem are you facing today? What do you need help with? What are you trying to do on your own that God would like to help you with? Rather than figure it out on her own, she turned to God in prayer and spent time talking to Him about it. Why not ask God for help? He wants to help you more than you realize. She experienced God's provision, expecting Him to answer. God wants to provide for us more than we realize. We just need to take the time to ask Him. What are you asking God to provide you with this morning? She kept her promise. God keeps His promises to us. We need to keep our promises with Him. What promise did you make to God that you have not kept? Maybe it's a promise you made a long time ago, and actually you haven't even thought about it for a while. But maybe it's being brought back to your memory this morning. And finally, She praised the one who answered her. We need to remember to thank God for his provision. When was the last time you thanked God for his provision in your life? In conclusion this morning, I want to tell you the end of the puppy story. I'd like to say that it had a happy ending. Well, we got the puppy, the girls had prayed for, but a year and a half later, that same dog drowned in the pool in our backyard. Now, needless to say, everyone in our home was devastated. We prayed, and we prayed. Rick even did mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but nothing happened. The dog died. You might ask, why would God provide you with a dog and then take it from you? I don't know the answer to that question. But here's what I do know. I know that God's provision is not dependent upon our understanding. Let me say it again. God's provision is not dependent upon our understanding. Peace comes when we give things to God in prayer. It does not wait for how he answers our prayers. Remember, Hannah's face was no longer saddened after she left her request with God. It didn't depend on the outcome of her request. The peace comes when we put the situation into God's hands and then trust him with it. No matter what circumstance you are facing today, you don't have to face it alone. Maybe you gave up talking to God a long time ago because you didn't think he heard you, or maybe he just didn't answer the way you wanted him to. I'd like to challenge you this morning to give him another chance. Start again. God wants to help and provide for you today, but the choice is up to you.